Underneath the dim fluorescent lights of Blackwater Penitentiary, the air always seemed heavier, thicker, as though the walls themselves were suffocating anyone who dared to breathe inside them. The prison had been built in the 1930s, a towering, Gothic fortress surrounded by endless marshlands. Inmates whispered about the things they'd heard, the screams echoing through the vents at night, the shadows that didn't match their sources, and the guards who disappeared without explanation. Most dismissed it as the ramblings of broken men, but the new arrivals quickly learned Blackwater was no ordinary prison. It started with Jacob Renner, a first-time offender sentenced to 5 for armed robbery. He'd heard the stories before arriving, how Cell Block D was cursed, how no one who stayed there for more than a month left the same. But he wasn't one to believe in ghost stories. Just a place for tough guys to scare each other, he thought. Renner was assigned to Cell 26, deep in Block D, at the farthest end of the corridor. His cellmate, Eddie Slim Mathis, was an old-timer who had been there for almost a decade. Slim barely spoke, spent most of his time scratching strange symbols into the wall with a piece of rusted metal. Renner thought it was just Slim's way of coping with the monotony of prison life. But the symbols gave him an uneasy feeling. When he asked Slim about them, the older man's cloudy eyes narrowed. "You'll understand soon enough," Slim muttered before turning his back to Renner. The first few nights were uneventful. Renner got used to the distant clang of metal doors, the occasional shout from a fellow inmate, and the low hum of the prison's ancient electrical system. But on the fourth night, he woke to a strange sound, a faint whispering just on the edge of hearing. It was coming from the vent above his bunk. At first, he thought it was someone on the other side, but as he strained to listen, he realized the words weren't in any language he knew. They were guttural, wet, and filled with malice. When he mentioned it to Slim the next day, the old man shook his head. "Don't listen. That's how it starts. You hear them long enough, they get in your head. They'll make you see things." Renner brushed it off, but the whispers continued, growing louder each night. By the end of the first week, he wasn't just hearing them, he was seeing shadows in the corner of his vision, darting just out of sight. He stopped sleeping, his nerves frayed to the point where even the smallest sound made him jump. It wasn't just Renner. Other inmates in Block D began to complain about nightmares, dreams of drowning, of being buried alive, of hands clawing at them from the dark. Fights broke out over nothing, and one man was found hanging in his cell, his face twisted in terror. The guards chalked it up to the stress of prison life, but Slim knew better. "They're feeding," Slim whispered one night, his voice trembling. "This place, it's alive. It's hungry." The breaking point came 2 weeks later. Renner woke to find Slim standing at the cell door, staring out into the corridor. The old man was mumbling something under his breath, his voice barely audible over the now deafening whispers from the vent. "What are you doing?" Renner asked, his voice shaking. Slim turned and Renner's blood ran cold. The old man's eyes were completely black, as though the pupils had consumed the whites. His face twisted into a grotesque grin and his voice took on an otherworldly tone. "They want you, Jacob." Before Renner could react, the lights in the block flickered and went out, plunging everything into darkness. The whispers became a cacophony, echoing from every corner. He heard screams, real, human screams, as the other inmates begged for help. Something wet and cold brushed against his arm, and he scrambled back, his heart pounding. When the lights flickered back on, the corridor was empty. Doors hung open, but there were no guards, no inmates, just silence. Renner looked at Slim, who had collapsed to the floor, lifeless. The symbols he had carved into the walls glowed faintly, pulsating like a heartbeat. Renner ran, sprinting down the corridor and out into the main yard. The prison was in chaos, alarms blaring, guards shouting, but no one could explain what had happened. Over the next few days, the disappearances were swept under the rug, and Block D was quietly closed off for renovations. The survivors, few as they were transferred to other facilities. Years later, Blackwater was shut down entirely. Locals swore they could still hear the screams coming from the abandoned building at night, and thrill-seekers who ventured inside rarely came back. Renner never spoke about what happened. He lived out the rest of his sentence in another prison, but he was never the same. The whispers never truly left him, and sometimes in the dead of night, he'd see shadows darting just out of sight. Blackwater Penitentiary had taken a piece of him, and he knew it was only a matter of time before it came back to claim the rest.
Story number 2.
Ironwood Correctional Facility was a grim relic of the past, a prison built in the 1900s to house the worst of society. Its halls were lined with rusted bars, cracked concrete, and an unbearable stench that never quite went away. The prisoners had their own name for the solitary confinement wing, the Hole. It was where they sent the truly unruly, but not just for punishment. The Hole had a legend, a story the inmates told in hushed tones. It was about the Crawling Man. Nobody knew his real name or when he first appeared, but every inmate who spent a night in the Hole claimed they'd seen him. He wasn't a ghost, they said. Ghosts don't scrape. Ghosts don't claw. The story went that years ago, a prisoner named Marcus Wilkes had been left in the Hole for too long. Solitary was supposed to be temporary, but the guards forgot about him, or maybe they just didn't care. When they finally opened the steel door weeks later, they found him curled in a corner, his skin stretched taut over his bones, his eyes wide open but lifeless. He had starved to death, scratching the walls with his bare hands until his fingernails tore off. But that wasn't the end of Marcus Wilkes. Prisoners started disappearing in the Hole after dark, their screams echoing through the vents, followed by an eerie silence. Guards found empty cells the next morning, blood smeared on the walls and deep gouges in the floors. "The Crawling Man got him," the inmates whispered. When Derek Finch was thrown into the Hole, he didn't believe in ghost stories. A convicted murderer with a chip on his shoulder, Derek didn't fear much. The guards slammed the heavy door shut behind him, plunging him into pitch darkness. "Enjoy your stay," one of them sneered, before the metallic clang of the lock echoed through the corridor. The first few hours were uneventful. Derek paced the tiny cell, muttering curses under his breath. The air was damp, the silence oppressive. The only sound was the faint drip of water somewhere deep within the prison. But then he heard it, a scraping noise. Faint at first, like nails dragging across stone. Derek froze, his heart pounding. He listened, straining to hear over the blood rushing in his ears. There it was again, closer this time. He pressed his ear against the steel door, thinking it was a guard trying to mess with him. "Nice try," he called out, his voice trembling slightly. The scraping stopped. Derek exhaled, shaking his head. But then it started again, louder, more frantic. It wasn't coming from the door, it was coming from the floor. He backed away, his eyes struggling to adjust to the darkness. The sound grew louder, accompanied by a low, guttural moan. Derek crouched, squinting at the concrete floor. At first, he saw nothing, but then from the shadows of the corner, something began to emerge. A hand. It was emaciated, the skin gray and stretched over the bones. The fingernails were broken, jagged, and bloodied. The hand clawed its way forward, followed by an arm, then a shoulder. Derek stumbled back, his breath hitching in his throat as the figure fully emerged. It was a man, or what used to be one. His face was gaunt, the eyes sunken deep into their sockets, glowing faintly in the darkness. His mouth opened impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged, yellowed teeth. He moved on all fours, his joints bending unnaturally, his movements insect-like. Who are you?" Derek stammered, his back pressed against the wall. The Crawling Man didn't answer. He just stared at Derek, his head cocked to one side as though studying him. Then, with a sudden burst of speed, he lunged. Derek screamed, but no one came. The guards never responded to screams from the Hole. The next morning, when the guards opened the cell, they found it empty. Blood streaked the walls, and deep claw marks scarred the floor. There was no sign of Derek Finch. The prison administration dismissed it as an escape, but the inmates knew better. That night, the whispers in the cell blocks were louder than ever. The Crawling Man got another one. No one ever volunteered to go into the Hole after that. It remained locked, the door rusted shut, but the inmates swore they could still hear the scraping sounds at night. Some said the Crawling Man was waiting, biding his time until someone else was foolish enough to set him free. And when they did, he'd crawl again.
Story number 3.
Crescent Ridge Penitentiary stood isolated in the shadow of a mountain range, surrounded by dense woods and jagged cliffs. It was said to have been built over sacred land, though the details were lost to time. No one questioned it too much. After all, the place was meant to hold society's worst criminals. But the inmates had their own tales. The most chilling was about Cell 49, an unassuming room on the third floor of the North Wing. Guards never talked about it, but Everyone knew the stories. Prisoners assigned to cell 49 either disappeared, went mad, or begged to be moved after their first night. Ethan Cole didn't believe the rumors. He was new, young, and brash, locked up for a string of armed robberies. When the warden assigned him to cell 49, he laughed off the warnings from his fellow inmates. "It's a cell, not a haunted house," he scoffed. That night, as the guards escorted him to the north wing, the air seemed to change. The temperature dropped, and the usual clamor of the prison faded into an eerie silence. Even the guards seemed uneasy, their footsteps hesitant as they approached cell 49. The cell was no different from the others. A metal bunk, a toilet, and a small window with iron bars. But the air inside felt heavy, as though it was pressing down on Ethan's chest. "Get comfortable," one guard muttered, his eyes avoiding Ethan's. The door slammed shut, the sound echoing ominously down the corridor. Ethan lay on the bunk, staring at the ceiling. At first, everything was normal. He could hear the faint murmurs of other inmates, the occasional clang of metal bars, and the distant hum of the prison's ventilation system. But as the hours dragged on, the noises outside faded until there was only silence. And then he heard it. A faint tapping. It came from the wall next to his bunk, rhythmic and deliberate. Ethan sat up, squinting in the darkness. "Who's there?" he called, his voice steady despite the unease creeping up his spine. The tapping stopped. For a moment, he thought he'd imagined it, but then it started again, louder this time. It wasn't coming from the wall, it was coming from inside it. Ethan pressed his ear against the cold concrete, his pulse racing. The tapping was joined by something else, a faint scratching sound, blown like nails dragging across stone. It was slow, methodical, and it was getting closer. He backed away, his eyes darting around the cell. The shadows seemed to shift and writhe, but it was impossible to tell if it was a trick of the dim light or something else. The tapping grew louder, echoing in his skull, and with it came a low, guttural voice. "Let me out!" Ethan's blood ran cold. He stumbled back, his hands gripping the edge of the metal bunk. "Who are you? What do you want?" The voice didn't answer, but the walls began to vibrate, the sound resonating like a low growl. The scratching intensified, and cracks began to spread across the concrete, spidering out from the spot where Ethan had pressed his ear. And then the wall burst open. A thick black mist poured into the cell, twisting and writhing like a living thing. In its center was a figure, hunched and skeletal, with hollow eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. Its limbs were unnaturally long, its fingers ending in claws that scraped against the floor as it moved. "You shouldn't have come here," the figure hissed, its voice like the grinding of stone. Ethan scrambled for the door, pounding on it and screaming for the guards. But the hallway outside was silent, the lights flickering ominously. The figure crept closer, its movements unnaturally fluid, its hollow eyes fixed on him. When the guards finally opened the door the next morning, Ethan was gone. The walls of cell 49 were intact, but the floor was smeared with blood, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. The warden sealed cell 49 that same day, ordering it never to be opened again. But the stories persisted. Inmates claimed to hear the tapping at night, faint and distant, as though it was searching for someone else to take. And every so often, on the quietest nights, a voice could be heard through the walls, whispering the same chilling words. "Let."
Story number 4.
There was an unwritten rule among the guards at Granite Hollow Penitentiary. Never take the staircase near the South Tower after dark. It was a strange rule, whispered from one rookie guard to the next, often dismissed as an old superstition. The staircase spiraled down into the sublevels of the prison, an area long abandoned after a fire gutted much of it years ago. It was supposed to be sealed off, but the heavy metal door at the top was always left unlocked for reasons no one could explain. Most guards avoided it altogether, but Officer Darren Marks, a no-nonsense skeptic, had no patience for ghost stories. "Just a bunch of old pipes and shadows," he told his fellow officers when they warned him. Nothing down there but rats. One late shift, Darren was making his rounds when he found himself near the South Tower. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, casting uneven shadows on the cold stone walls. He glanced at the staircase door and hesitated. The whispers from his colleagues had piqued his curiosity. He decided to prove them all wrong. Opening the heavy door, Darren found the staircase just as they described, narrow, winding, and descending into darkness. The air was damp and smelled faintly of mildew. His flashlight beam barely penetrated the gloom as he stepped onto the first creaking step. Each step echoed unnaturally, as though the staircase stretched much farther than it should. The deeper he descended, the colder the air became. Darren began to notice something strange. The walls were damp, but there were no signs of water dripping from above. It was as if the moisture seeped from the stone itself. After a few minutes, he stopped to catch his breath. He should have reached the bottom by now. According to the prison blueprints, the staircase was only supposed to go down 3 flights, leading to an old storage basement. But he had already descended far more than that, and the bottom was nowhere in sight. Turning back, he aimed his flashlight up the stairs. The door he'd entered from was gone. Darren's stomach twisted. He cursed under his breath, trying to convince himself it was just a trick of the dark. He resumed his descent, reasoning that there had to be an exit somewhere below. The further he went, the stranger things became. The steps seemed to stretch longer, the spaces between them widening. The air grew heavier, pressing against his chest, making it harder to breathe. And then the sounds began. At first, it was subtle, a faint rustling like fabric brushing against stone. But as he descended, the noises grew louder, whispers, guttural and incoherent, echoing from the walls. He paused, his heart pounding, and swung his flashlight in every direction. The beam illuminated nothing but endless stone steps. And then he saw it. A figure just a few steps below him, barely visible in the faint glow of his flashlight. It stood motionless, its features obscured by the shadows, but its presence was undeniable. Darren froze, his grip tightening on the flashlight. "Who's there?" he called, his voice shaking despite himself. The figure didn't move, but the whispers grew louder as though the walls themselves were alive, murmuring secrets he couldn't understand. Darren took a cautious step back, his instincts screaming at him to run. The figure began to climb, moving up the stairs with jerky, unnatural movements. Its head tilted at an odd angle, and its limbs bent in ways they shouldn't. Darren turned and ran. His boots clanged against the steps, his breath ragged as he sprinted up the endless staircase. The whispers grew deafening, overlapping into a cacophony of voices that seemed to claw at his sanity. The air was so cold now that each exhale formed a visible cloud. He didn't dare look back. Finally, after what felt like hours, he saw it, a faint light above. The door. His salvation. Darren pushed himself harder, his legs burning, the whispers now joined by the sound of scraping, as though nails were dragging across the stone behind him. Bursting through the door, Darren slammed it shut and collapsed against it, his chest heaving. The whispers stopped instantly, replaced by the familiar hum of the prison's fluorescent lights. But something was wrong. The hallway was empty, the walls bare concrete instead of the tiled ones he remembered. The layout was unfamiliar, the air thick with a musty, metallic scent. Darren stumbled to his feet, his flashlight flickering. He wandered the halls, calling out for help, but his voice echoed back at him, empty and alone. He never found the other guards. The prison seemed endless, its corridors looping back on themselves, leading him deeper into a maze he couldn't escape. And somewhere in the distance, faintly at first, then louder, came the sound of footsteps descending a staircase that no longer existed.
Story number 5.
Eastern Pines Correctional Facility had always been a source of dread, even for the guards who worked there. Perched on a desolate hill, surrounded by dying trees, the prison loomed like a shadow over the small nearby town. Among the many stories whispered in its halls, the one that terrified even the hardest inmates and most jaded guards was about the warden's room. The room wasn't on any official map of the prison. It was hidden behind a false wall in the administrative wing, accessible only by a narrow, unmarked staircase. The story went that decades ago, Warden Victor Hall had a private office built there where he could take care of business away from prying eyes. But what he did in that room wasn't administrative. Victor Hall had been a sadist. Inmates who crossed him, or even those who didn't, were dragged up to his private room. The guards never asked questions, though they often heard the screams late into the night. Those who went into the room never came back. The warden eventually disappeared under mysterious circumstances, but the room remained. Sealed. Forgotten, or so they thought. Years later, Officer Lyle Travers, a new hire looking to make a name for himself, was assigned the graveyard shift. While patrolling the admin wing one night, his flashlight flickered and he felt an inexplicable chill. He turned a corner and noticed something odd. A faint seam in the wall where no door should have been. Curiosity got the better of him. Lyle ran his fingers along the seam and found a hidden latch. With a soft click, the false wall swung inward, revealing a narrow, dusty staircase descending into darkness. The air that wafted up was cold, damp, and suffocating, carrying a faint metallic tang that made his stomach churn. Against his better judgment, Lyle descended. The staircase spiraled down farther than he expected, each step creaking under his weight. The walls were bare concrete, lined with decades-old stains that looked disturbingly organic. At the bottom, he found a heavy wooden door, its surface carved with strange, jagged symbols. He hesitated. Something deep inside him screamed to turn back, but his pride pushed him forward. The door creaked open into a room that felt like it didn't belong in the world above. It was dimly lit by a single flickering bulb dangling from a frayed wire. The floor was concrete, stained dark with splotches that hadn't faded with time. Chains hung from the walls, some still bearing rusted manacles. But it was the chair in the center of the room that stopped Lyle cold. It was an old wooden chair with straps on the arms and legs, positioned beneath a grotesque mirror that stretched across the ceiling. The glass was warped, its reflection distorted and unsettling. As Lyle stepped closer, his flashlight beam wavered, and the mirror seemed to ripple, as though it were a pool of liquid instead of glass. A sudden sound made him jump, a low, guttural groan that seemed to come from the walls themselves. He swung his flashlight around, but the room was empty. The groan turned into whispers, countless voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony of pain and anger. Leave. 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 The mirror above the chair shimmered, and Lyle froze as a figure began to take shape within its warped reflection. It was a man, tall, gaunt, and dressed in an old-fashioned warden's uniform. His face was pale and hollow, his eyes empty sockets that seemed to suck in the light. The figure raised a hand and pointed directly at Lyle. Lyle stumbled back, his breath hitching. He turned to flee, but the door slammed shut behind him with a deafening bang. The whispers turned to screams, and the air grew so cold that frost began to creep across the walls. The chair in the center of the room creaked. Lyle turned just in time to see the man from the mirror now sitting in the chair, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. Slowly, the warden's hollow eyes fixed on Lyle, and a twisted grin spread across his face. "You shouldn't have come here," the warden hissed, his voice layered with the echoes of 1,000 others. The chains on the walls rattled and began to move, slithering toward Lyle like living things. He screamed, battering at the door, but it wouldn't budge. The last thing he saw was the warden rising from the chair, his long skeletal fingers reaching out as the chains coiled around him like snakes. Lyle was never seen again. The next morning, his flashlight and radio were found at the end of the admin wing, near a blank section of wall. The other guards assumed he had abandoned his post and fled, but the inmates knew better. Every so often, late at night, the hidden door reappears. And if you listen closely near the admin wing, you can still hear the faint sound of chains rattling and muffled screams from deep below.
Story number 6.
Blackstone Penitentiary was infamous not only for its brutal history, but for its sinister architecture. The prison was built over an abandoned asylum, and many claimed its foundations still bore the scars of what happened there. Inmates often said the place had a life of its own, that sometimes it felt like the walls were watching. But nothing was more feared than Cell 36. Located in the oldest part of the prison, Cell 36 had been empty for decades. No one was officially assigned there anymore, not after what had happened to the last inmate who stayed in it. Still, every guard and prisoner knew to avoid it. The air around the cell always felt colder, and strange noises echoed from its direction at night. The story went that the cell wasn't abandoned because of its condition, but because it was alive. Raymond Grant, a new inmate serving life for armed robbery, didn't believe in ghost stories. When he was assigned to Cell 36, he didn't bat an eye. He figured the other prisoners were just trying to scare him. His first night was uneventful. The cell was no different from the others, cold, damp, and utterly miserable. He lay on the thin mattress, staring at the cracked ceiling, listening to the distant murmurs of the other inmates. But then, as the prison fell silent, he heard it. A a low, steady noise like the exhale of a sleeping giant. At first he thought it was just the wind or the old pipes groaning, but the sound was rhythmic, rising and falling like someone, or something, was breathing. Raymond sat up, his eyes scanning the darkness. The sound seemed to be coming from the walls themselves. He placed his hand against the cold concrete, and that's when he felt it, a faint, rhythmic pulse like a heartbeat. He yanked his hand back, his pulse quickening. "Just my imagination," he muttered, lying back down. The second night was worse. The breathing sound returned, louder this time, and it was joined by whispers. Faint, disjointed voices that seemed to seep from the cracks in the walls. They didn't make sense, but they carried an unmistakable tone of desperation, as if pleading for help. Raymond pressed his hands over his ears, but the whispers grew louder, crawling into his head. His vision blurred, and for a moment, he thought he saw the walls shifting, the surface rippling like water. By the third night, Raymond was desperate to be moved. He begged the guards, but they just laughed, calling him soft. That night, the cell came alive. The breathing was no longer distant. It was everywhere, surrounding him, filling the air with an oppressive weight. The walls seemed to contract and expand, as if the room itself was inhaling and exhaling. The whispers became screams, overlapping cries of pain and anger that echoed in his skull. Then the cracks in the walls began to widen. From the darkness within, black tendrils emerged, writhing like snakes. They slithered toward him, reaching for his arms, his legs. He screamed, flailing wildly, but the tendrils moved with an unnatural speed, coiling around him and pulling him toward the wall. As his body was dragged closer, he saw faces in the concrete, distorted, screaming faces, their mouths open in silent agony. They looked at him with hollow eyes, and he realized they were the voices he had been hearing. "Help us," one of them mouthed, its expression twisted in torment. The wall began to open, revealing a dark, pulsating void. The tendrils pulled harder, and Raymond's screams echoed through the prison. The next morning, when the guards arrived, cell 36 was empty. The walls were unmarked, and there was no sign of Raymond Grant. His disappearance was filed as an escape attempt, though no one believed it. Inmates still say that late at night, if you pass by cell 36, you can hear the sound of breathing. Some claim to see faces in the walls, their eyes wide with terror, as though they're watching and waiting for the next soul to claim. No one stays in cell 36 anymore. But the prison knows that it's just a matter of time before someone new gets locked inside. And when they do, the cell will breathe again.
Story number 7.
Greystone Correctional Facility was a sprawling fortress of stone and iron, its walls towering over the barren landscape. Most of the prison was active, housing hundreds of inmates. But there was one area that no one dared to enter. Block E. Block E had been abandoned for over 40 years after a riot claimed the lives of dozens of inmates and guards. The official story was that the block was condemned due to structural damage, but the truth was far darker. Guards spoke in hushed tones about what really happened there. During the riot, something had been unleashed, something not entirely human. Survivors claimed they saw shadows moving on their own, heard laughter in the screams, and watched as prisoners vanished into thin air. Since then, Block E had been sealed, its corridors left to rot. But one stormy night, a power outage left the entire facility in chaos. Officer Kevin Ross, a rookie on his first overnight shift, was ordered to check the backup generator located in the sub-basement beneath Block E. "Just get in, make sure it's running, and get out," his supervisor told him. "And don't wander." Kevin wasn't superstitious, but the stories about Block E had unsettled him. Still, he had a job to do. Armed with only a flashlight, he made his way through the labyrinthine halls toward the old block. As he approached, the air grew colder. The walls seemed to close in, the silence broken only by the faint hum of the emergency lights. The door to Block E was rusty but unlocked, its hinges screeching as he pushed it open. Inside, the block was a graveyard of decay. Rusted bars, crumbling walls, and a stench of mildew filled the air. His flashlight beam flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to move just out of sight. He found the staircase leading to the sub-basement and descended, each step groaning under his weight. The generator room was just ahead, its metal door slightly ajar. Kevin stepped inside and immediately felt the oppressive weight of the room. The generator was running, its low rumble vibrating through the floor. But something was wrong. The walls were covered in deep scratches, as if some massive creature had clawed at them. On the floor were strange symbols drawn in what looked disturbingly like blood. Kevin's unease grew. He turned to leave, but the door slammed shut on its own, the sound echoing through the room. His flashlight flickered and died, plunging him into darkness. And then he heard it. A low, guttural growl. Kevin froze, his breath hitching. The sound came again, closer this time, followed by the scrape of something sharp against metal. He fumbled for his radio, but it only emitted static. "Who's there?" he called, his voice trembling. The growl turned into a distorted laugh, echoing around the room. Kevin's flashlight flickered back to life, and he swung it around wildly. In the corner of the room, something moved. It was hunched, its limbs twisted and elongated, its eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. The creature's skin was pale and stretched tight over its bones, and its grin revealed jagged, yellowed teeth. Kevin stumbled back, his heart pounding. The creature tilted its head, watching him with a predatory intensity. "You shouldn't have come," it hissed, its voice a grotesque mix of human and animal tones. Kevin bolted for the door, but it wouldn't budge. The creature lunged, moving with unnatural speed, its claws scraping against the walls as it closed the distance. Kevin screamed, throwing himself against the door with all his strength. At the last moment, it gave way, and he tumbled into the corridor. He didn't look back, sprinting up the stairs and through the halls of Block E. Behind him, he could hear the creature's laughter, a sound that chased him all the way back to the main block. When he finally reached the safety of the active prison, he collapsed, gasping for breath. The other guards found him pale and shaking, unable to speak. Kevin quit the next day. He refused to explain what had happened, but his eyes held a haunted look that never went away. Block E was sealed even tighter after that, but the stories didn't stop. Inmates reported hearing growls and laughter coming from the direction of the block during storms. Some claimed to see glowing eyes watching them from the darkness. The prison administrators insisted it was all nonsense, but deep down, everyone knew the truth. Block E wasn't abandoned because it was unsafe. It was abandoned because something was still there, waiting for anyone foolish enough to come looking.